Hello and welcome. I'm Jethro Swanson, though I often go by Hongul Shade online. I recently had a very lovely discussion with a pro-life demonstrator. They sometimes come to the University of Manitoba, and while I am very far on the pro-choice spectrum, basically fine with abortion up until birth, I think that there's a lot of dishonest discussion around them. A lot of people in the more extremist far left spaces will accuse anyone who is pro-life of being like evil women-hating misogynists, which couldn't be almost any further than reality. There's many women who hold the values and beliefs that they have nothing to do with hating women. I think it's perfectly fine and good to have disagreements with things. I personally disagree with them on their ultimate conclusions. But you should never be trying to perpetrate this kind of deceit, these kind of lies about a certain group. I really dislike that kind of behavior and how common it's become on the left. And so, in the spirit of trying to have honest conversations and bring a little bit more integrity to discussions around this, I wanted to invite one of them on and find out what they actually believe and allow them to express their true beliefs rather than an insane caricature from extremists on the other side. So with that, please join us as we defend the indefensible. Yeah, so I guess we can begin. In the first place, I always like to begin with any of these things is going to your background. Like, you growing up, how were you raised, where you grew up, the kind of culture and stuff, to see coming to this point and what we're talking about, how did you kind of get here, where are you coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. That can be a very long story or a very short story, depending on how I tell it, I'm sure. I am the youngest daughter in fairly good sized family. I've got five siblings. So lots of older siblings, one younger brother as well. And yeah, I was actually homeschooled. My parents were both educated in the public school system. My mom actually, when she first had a good friend who started homeschooling, she was like, is that even legal? But actually really enjoyed watching her friend just get to be part of her kids' lives in that way. And so she was like, oh, I'm going to try this with my kids. And so I had the benefit of getting to have really cool relationships with my siblings, knowing them really well. And I loved being homeschooled. It was super fun. We still got lots of the really great aspects that I feel like people get from school of being part of sports teams and different things like that. But kind of a different education process there than a lot of people had. And yeah, after that, I actually started working as a nanny and worked in private childcare for several years. Lots of really great memories. That way, worked for about three different families over about 8 years, which was a really great experience. And then eventually transitioned into the work that I'm doing now, which is full-time pro-life work for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. So
Yeah, so part of the reason I brought you on is because there's sometimes protests or demonstrations at the University of Manitoba, where I was going to school, and they incited the counter protests and stuff. But I felt like a lot of the conversations around it were never really good. Because I'm definitely more on the side of I'm definitely more pro-choice, but I felt like a lot of the arguments made against pro-life people always it came down to just oh, well, they're all just so evil and sexist misogynist people. That's what they just want to control women or whatever. Which I have friends who are pro-life, and that it's a extremely gross mixed characterization of anything that is actually the belief structure. And I feel like if you disagree with someone, that's fine, but you should honestly disagree with what they're saying. You should counter what they're actually claiming, and not making some crazy straw man and then being well, I don't like that, right? Given that it is starting, I want to know just maybe your general beliefs on abortion and stuff. Obviously, you're pro-life if you're working with that institution, but I want to know yeah, what are your beliefs? I'm just going to open it very generally, and then we can get into stuff.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that there's a big issue with abortion around the world and in our country in particular. And I largely, when I think about abortion, I would start by thinking about why people are considering having an abortion in the first place. And I'm sure on both sides, there can be a lot of agreement on the fact that it's a broken world and there's a lot of really, really difficult situations that people face, right? Everything from abuse within a family to financial difficulties. You met our group at the University of Manitoba. Obviously, there's students there that are navigating a really busy season and they've put a lot of work and financial expenditure towards the courses that they're taking. And so there's a lot of different factors in people's lives that when they find themselves pregnant unexpectedly, that can be a really scary and a really difficult experience. And so I like to start there because I think that's where most people are starting when they think about abortion, whether they're getting one themselves or they're thinking about someone who may already have chosen abortion or maybe considering an abortion. And all of us, I would hope, really, really want to help those people and understand where they're coming from and just recognize the difficulties that surround this issue. And with that in mind, I guess I often think about the fact that we can see parents with older children, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, who also face really, really difficult scenarios like these. And none of us would ever say it's okay to kill a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old child on purpose. And I think that's what brings us to kind of the core heart of the issue, which is where there's actually a lot of disagreement, it seems, around the humanity of a preborn child and whether or not those children should get human rights. And for me, that's really what it comes down to is like when we look at these kinds of difficulties and the people that are navigating them, what is an appropriate response to help and address these issues? Can that ever include purposely killing an innocent human being? So that's kind of why I hold the viewpoint that I do. I think abortion's a human rights violation. And I think that there's so much better that we can do for women and families that find themselves in a crisis pregnancy situation for any number of reasons than what abortion actually offers.
Interesting. All right. So yeah, I have two questions. I guess one would be like, so at what point do you say that like we should start like considering someone like human or giving like whatever various rights and stuff? Like when does that happen and to what extent, I guess?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two questions in what you just said. There are two really important ones. So I'm going to separate them in order to do due diligence to each of them. One is when do we have a human, right? When does human life begin, is another way of saying that. And the other is when does that human life, or when should that human life have value and get human rights? And so if I start maybe with the first one, because I think the second one leans onto the first one quite a bit, I would actually look at biology and embryology textbooks and other scientific papers that have been written on just the basics of when human life begins. Around the world, there are scientific experts who have told us that human life begins at fertilization when sperm and egg come together. That marks the beginning of a new human life. And so, with that caveat of if we have something that's growing and developing, and we know that both of the parents of that of that living organism are human, then surely we must have a living human. So that's how I would answer that first question, largely just looking to what we understand with the science of reproduction. And then if I take that answer and we say, okay, so biologically speaking, we have a living human. Does that human get value assigned to it? Do they have rights like you and I? And that's where I'd ask the question of like, shouldn't all human beings get human rights? Like, if you have a human whose life has begun, shouldn't their rights begin at the same time? And if not, then like, what are we using as the factor for discriminating those rights? If we're saying this is a human, but they don't have rights. Why is that? And that would kind of be the next question I would look at after that.
Yeah, yeah, but I think part of the issue where I take issue with it is that I feel like just by nature of being human, don't think is like that's it is the like things that come after being human that like actually provide value. Like in my mind, it's intelligence and higher level cognitive stuff because we don't have the same rights for like animals like a cow, say, even though it is a living being and at the early stages of development, it's very similar for the most part to like any other like human or any other kind of embryos and stuff when they're first developing. There's a few like cells and stuff, and it's like the value. I think the value would have to claim that it's what it's becoming that is of any value. But I feel like at that stage it isn't anything like yeah I would say that I think it's the actual intelligence or like cognitive function, and so there isn't any I would maybe put forward that there probably isn't any wrong any more than it is like killing an animal's fetus than killing a human fetus who can't like really experience anything and has never experienced anything when it's just like some cells. Let's say at the very, very early stages of development. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think that is a very, very important point in it, and one that not only yourself, but many people would bring forward in considering abortion, right? Because when we look at a newly developing human, especially in the first few hours, the first few days, you're right that it's going from one cell to two cells to four cells. And there isn't a lot of those attributes that we can see in older humans like you and I, right? There's not the same degree of awareness and intelligence and those kinds of things. And the interesting question I would ask you is like, if we agree that it is a human biologically, I'd have to ask the question of like, why are they different from us in those ways? Isn't it because of how old they are? In that, if you have a human that has not yet developed the ability to talk and walk and do the things that you and I can do, is that because of what they are? The way that some animals might not have that same intelligence as us? Or is it because of how old they are? In the same way as a 2-year-old can't do the things that a 6-year-old can do, and especially can't do the things that you and I can do. And so I agree with you, there's a lot of differences between a preborn child, a human developing in the womb, and a human that's been born. I guess my concern is if we say that it's not enough to be human, that you have to be human plus an additional attribute like a certain degree of intelligence or an additional attribute like awareness. How is that different than other times in history when we've said you have to be human plus an attribute like a certain race or human plus an attribute like a certain gender? And I'm sure, like most of our society, yourself included, I would imagine, we don't think it's okay to add qualifications on top of being human if those qualifications are something like race or gender, right? If you said you had to be human plus a certain race to get human rights, we call that racism. Or if you said you have to be human plus a certain gender, would call that sexism. And so my question would be like, is it any better for us to say that you have to be human plus a certain age? Wouldn't that be age-based discrimination?
We sure, yeah, I think it is I think the difference there though is that the problem with like saying you have to be like human plus a certain race or plus a certain, the problem there is that there isn't much difference between races. That would be the issue. If there was, let's say there was like some third whatever sex and all those people developed and they essentially I don't know, in this fairy tale world, if on this rare sex, they all kind of turned into dogs. Like they had the same intelligence as dogs. They like there was like a 1 in a million chance that like
a human fetus just turned into a dog randomly, like that was the case to be, I would argue that then you could say that they have whatever less rights and stuff. The issue that comes with sexism and racism stuff is taking away rights when there isn't a sufficient justification, because the race, like, the arguments would be that like certain races or sexes are inferior, which we can kind of know is false. We can tell that it's false, that they're not like generally less intelligent to any notable degree or competent or whatever. And so we say that restricting rights is not right in that case. But with, I guess, age here, if with development of like becoming a human, there is a very clear, like they very clearly, like their brains aren't even like in existence in the early stages. They are just cells. So I think we can safely say that it is notably different. The issue that comes up with those kinds of things doesn't appear here because there are underlying actual differences.
And I would definitely agree with you that there are very real differences. My concern is if we say that there has to be a certain degree of difference that then allows for discrimination. When we look at, like, for instance, a lot of the eugenics situations that have happened throughout history when people with mental or physical disabilities have been discriminated against, people have pointed to, like, yeah, there's a bigger difference in cognitive function, or there's a bigger difference in intelligence, or in even physical function, what people are able to do. And with that, I would just ask the question of, like, should we get basic human rights? Like, really just bringing it all the way down to the right to not be killed based off of what we can do or based off of who we are as human individuals. Like, whether someone is able to do the things that I can do or not, I would consider them equally valuable by nature of being equally human to as I am, right? You and I have differences, and sure, they would be smaller in comparison by far to the differences between myself and a preborn child. And yet, if those differences were greater, does that make you or I less valuable than one another? And generally in our society, we don't say so, right? Like, generally, we actually say that when people are less able, I think of, like, for example, handicap parking stalls being put at the front of the parking lot where I think they absolutely should be. We say that if someone is less able to do something for themselves, we should actually protect and support and come alongside those people, not give them less value and less protection as a result. And so I guess the question I would ask there is, like, how big does the variance have to be in what we can do in order to justify dismembering someone, which is what happens in an abortion, right? Of, like, to actually say that a human being is not, like, should not be protected, is not valuable enough to even get basic human rights. I think that just becomes a really slippery slope really fast when we start saying that some members of the human family don't meet up to a certain level of expectation. Then how do we prevent that bar from extending to more and more? Because throughout history, there have been cases made that many people shouldn't qualify. Like, I brought up the case for women, right? I was actually reading a paper just the other day that was talking about, yeah, when women were being given the right or fighting for the right to vote. And one of the arguments that was put forward at the time was that women didn't have the intelligence to vote. Now, I clearly disagree with that. I very much think that I am capable of voting, and my friends and all of the women that I know are capable of that. And yet at the time, that was actually a belief that they didn't think was true of women, and they were putting that forward as an argument. And so I think clearly that they were mistaken, but I think they actually believed that. And I would just ask, like, in our time, we may truly believe that these human beings are less valuable than us. But does that mean that they actually are? Or is it true that a human should be given human rights, even if they can't do the same things that another human can?
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like I just always go back to the same thing of it. The reason that humans are valuable is our higher level like cognitive functions, and if you haven't ever had that and you don't have the capacity for that until like you develop further or something, and you've never had that before, I don't see like the wrong, and I feel like it can be hard to like pinpoint an exact line. I feel like an easy one would just be like birth, because I think you could fairly clearly see that like before that they're not much more intelligent or whatever than like dogs or anything like that, and afterwards it can get like whatever blurry of like you brought up the thing of like people with like having a 2-year-old who they don't like want or anything, and we probably don't want them killed and stuff. So I feel like birth is such a nice, very clear like biological like cutoff point that where we can say, hey, maybe it might be still like there might be some moral whatever thing after that, but like any of the harm from like restricting it kind of goes away. So we're not really inflicting much harm on like parents or whatever by like saying no, you can't like kill your children and stuff. Because we have very easy like adoption things and stuff. Generally in our society that we can like solve that problem and make that not an issue, so it's not that. So I do feel like I still go back to intelligence, and I feel like if we're going to say that like it's just like humanness and we don't care like any of the capabilities, then like why do we stop at like exactly at fertilization? Like why not right before it? Like what's the difference? Like two cells are slightly far apart, then they're slightly closer, and then they're multiple. Like it's all one continuous process. So like why I don't see like what's if you're saying that it's just like human life is all valuable and stuff. What's the difference between like a something that's fertilized and someone like the second before it's fertilized, you like put a metal barrier right between them and they can't, and they both the cells like whatever die, and the human that would have been developed had you not intervened there doesn't exist and is dead now because you like intervened there. Like how do you justify that how do you differentiate those things if
I
it's
think
just
that is a really good question. So, kind of like, why fertilization as the point that life begins? Why not earlier in some ways, right? And that's where, if we actually look scientifically at what fertilization is, right? So, before fertilization, you have a sperm cell and you have an egg cell, which are reproductive cells of the man and the woman respectively, right? So they have half of either the man or the woman's DNA code in them. And if either one of those cells are left, they'll never develop into a fully grown human being on their own, right? And with that, I hear what you're saying of like, there is absolutely the potential, if those two come together, of a new human life. But ask us to look at the scientific research that's been done on like, is there a human life there yet? Because when we look at fertilization, there's actually something fundamentally different that has occurred. When the sperm and the egg cell come together all the way and they actually meet, in that moment, they cease to exist and become a new, unique individual member of the human family. And this is something that I definitely don't expect people to take my word on. Actually, I have it with me a pamphlet here that we were using at the university and that we refer to in a lot of our outreach. And one of the things we have in it is a quote from a textbook. I'll just turn it here so I can read it. So this would be from The Developing Human, which is clinically oriented embryology. This would be the 10th edition. This I would consider comparable to any embryology textbook that you want to look at. I talked to a couple students at U of M that I was like, hey, I don't know which embryology textbook you guys would have in your library, but I'd encourage you to go and reference it. And what this tells us is human development begins at fertilization when sperm fuses with an egg to form a single cell, the zygote. This marks the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. And so, just if I'm looking at the science, I'm told that there's actually something really different before fertilization as after. And personally, like, I don't have the same concern with preventing the possibility of human life. If someone doesn't want a new human to begin and they prevent that, I think that's a very different thing than if you have a new human life. And we now have to end that life on purpose by killing that human. That is now a different thing than preventing the potential from coming into being, right? And so, with that, that's where I would see fertilization as being a really important distinct point. Because if you have a whole individual human whose life has begun, then yes, they still have a lot of developing to do. Similar to a newborn infant, still has lots of developing to do before they're going to reach the mature human body. And yet, if you have that full individual human present and you have to kill them, that's where I think a human rights violation comes in the same way as if we killed an older human being.
I feel like it's more of a semantic thing. Like you point to the textbook where it says like we generally consider a human like the beginning of a human development, which is like sure, but like they're still just like two parts of a whole. Like they're still just two parts of like the genetic information, and they're still two different living organism type things, and then they come together and begin forming a new human. But it's all I don't see how it's any different if you have a situation where you know that those two things would, despite your intervention, they would have like came together and formed a new like human. Like I don't see like why like if you have two cells and you know, let's say in this hypothetical world we know 100% certain that they will whatever collide and it will get fertilized and it will develop into human. I don't see why we say that like the second before they collide it's different than the second after, and what about the second like after they collide and they begin fusing together and you say okay, well now we're gonna slam them whatever metal grate down and like separate them again or whatever. Like I don't see any real difference there because it's all just cells at this point and there isn't anything and because we're saying that it's not like any kind of actual like value other than it just being the nature of it being the same species as us is why the value is there. There doesn't seem to be any real difference. Like we could say that semantically we kind of consider humans to begin there, but that's not a sufficient like ethical or like moral argument, I don't think, as to why those things are different.
Yeah, so I think I hear what you're saying there. And with that, what I'd kind of look at is I think there can easily come in confusion between the process of construction and the process of development. And what I mean by that is like if you were to invite me over and be like, "Hey, I want to show you my new car." And I got to your house and you had like a couple of wheels laying on your driveway and maybe a few spare car parts lying around as well. And you're like, "Hey, what do you think of my new car?" To be honest, I'd probably say to you like, "Hey, like you've got the potential for a new car, but like this isn't a new car yet. This is just parts of a car." And it would be an interesting question of like how far into the process of building that car do you have to be before I would consider it to be a new car? Before I'd say like, okay, this is something different now. This is something that has value that I would consider a car in the same way as the car I drove up to your house in, right? That is actually how construction works. And to say that question of like, yeah, like, is it just parts of like how many parts do you have to put together before it becomes a new whole? But that's not the same process in development, which is why I point to the science textbooks, because when something is developing, it is fully the thing that it is, even when the development has not yet finished. I'll give you an example of that. If we look at a newborn infant, right, or a 2-year-old, any developing member of the species, we can see that they are not yet finished developing, right? A 2-year-old still has to go through puberty. They still have to grow a great deal. They still have to learn speech, and their brain is developing. I mean, we're told that our brains continue developing until what, 25 years old is when I have heard. And so with that, the process of development is going to continue for a long time, even after that point of birth that you had drawn. And yet, would you agree with me that throughout that whole process after birth, that individual is fully human, even though they are not fully developed?
Yeah, I would say they're fully human. The difference is that I don't ascribe like there's probably some slight premium, but I think the nature of being human doesn't give you anything. It's other traits that come with it that give the humans value, not by nature of human itself. So like generally what I point to is intelligence. I think the cognitive capacity that we have is what differentiates us and is why I would like value like let's say hypothetically we have aliens that were roughly as smart as us. I would say that they should also get like rights similar to human we have for like human rights. They should be like alien rights of a roughly same degree if they were as intelligent and as like cognitively capable as us. I don't think that it's necessarily anything to do with like what species the being is, and it's more to do with the traits that being has. So, if, for instance, if there happened to be like a dog who we like, I don't know, genetically modified to have a giant brain, and it could like maybe kind of talk, and it could have demonstrate like the intelligence of like let's say like a 12-year-old or something. I think it would be like morally wrong to like kill it or something. The same way that, unlike it's probably less morally wrong to like put down a dog who is not as intelligent or anything.
This kind of reminds me of the position that I've heard laid out by Peter Singer and other philosophers, kind of the idea of functionalism versus, I think that the word that Peter Singer used was speciesism, right? Of instead of saying that all members of a specific species have value and that could be multiple species, or right now we're talking about the human species, right? But rather he would say we need to look at the functionalism, which is kind of what you're pointing to, like the intelligence and those kinds of things. The interesting question then becomes like who determines what is the minimum requirement of function? So like Peter Singer has put forward the kind of the consideration of children up until the age of 2 don't have the same level of intelligence as animals that we do kill. And so, is it therefore okay to kill young born children because they also don't meet that criteria of function? And most people would actually kind of balk at that. I definitely do. Most people that I've met have in saying like that we should be free to kill human beings until 2 years of age. And the interesting thing is I can see that even if we like bring it closer back to the abortion question, I talk to people on the street regularly who are very alarmed and surprised by people suggesting that abortion's okay until birth. A lot of people don't realize that in Canada, abortion is legally permitted right until birth, that there's no legal restrictions on that. And there's a lot of people that feel really uncomfortable with that line. They might draw the line at the end of the second trimester of pregnancy, or they might draw the line at somewhere in between, like where we can first detect that the fetus feels pain. And so with that, there's a lot of different lines that different people would draw if we're looking at a certain degree of function. And I'd ask, like, doesn't that become an arbitrary and potentially a discriminatory line that we're drawing? We're saying that certain human beings qualify and others do not. And depending on who draws that line, we end up with different lines which may include more or less human beings. And so if Peter Singer was drawing the line based off of the arguments I've heard him make, children may be killed up until 2 years of age. Someone else might make the argument that until 25 years of age, when our brain is finished developing, we shouldn't qualify, and then a lot of us are in danger, right? And so I'd ask you the question of like, if we're going to go off of function, how do you protect against discrimination and who gets to determine when that value is set? Because human rights, most people believe, should equally apply to all human beings. And that's just not the case if we're looking at degrees of function, because even among adults, there's varying degrees of ability and function depending on a lot of different things from health considerations to general like IQ, right? And so I'm curious if we were to put that on the table, how does that not fit the model of a human rights violation that we are picking and choosing who meets the base level qualification off of an arbitrary standard?
Yeah, and so yeah, I do agree that it can be hard to like choose an exact line of like this is when people are like sufficiently cognitively like capable of something of like some kind of higher level thought or something. We do kind of draw these lines in society for like other things. For instance, we have an age of consent where we kind of draw a line. It can be hard to know exactly when a human can like um, intelligently agree to have like sex with another person or whatever and like fully understand the consequences of that and everything. But we do draw that line. We do draw these lines all the time. So it's not that we can't do it. So I agree that it would be hard, but like I think we can do it. We just have to be careful, which is why like I say like birth is such a nice line because well humans might be like whatever like I think Peter Singer I think was the name of the guy you mentioned, but I might say like they're probably not as intelligent as like animals or something up until like 2 years old. We have a nice line far before that, and it comes again with a nice very biological like separation of the two beings of mother and child or whatever that gives plenty of leeway and stops unnecessary difficulties for with like people because like part of the issue restricting abortion is also like the extra hardship that like goes on to women. So if we're going to do that, we want to be very sure that like it's an absolutely necessary thing. And it's a very good thing. And so it because I understand the idea of like the overall concept of like wanting to be more the conservative is like that not the exact word I want to use here because that's also
Inclusive?
yeah sure inclusive is maybe of like yeah you want to like expand like push it back as far kind of as possible to be 100% sure that you're not doing anything. I think part of the problem that kind of comes up, and this is a common like criticism against pro-life people, is the extra hardships that fall onto women and stuff who are then forced to carry children who they don't want. And in some cases, the kind of laws that kind of come out of banning abortion and stuff lead to some very negative consequences, including like death. We saw that down in I think it was Texas. We have and other places like that where kind of anti-abortion laws have been passed and stuff. And we do so there are some amount of very clear and real negative consequences and stuff for women to have these kind of things. So I feel like, given that we humans don't generally seem to have a level of intelligence until of equivalent to like animals or things where we don't really care about until let's say maybe 2 years or so and stuff. And there is a very real negative consequences for people if we restrict this. It feels like there is a very good case for allowing abortion. So like, how do you deal with the negative outcomes of your kind of the proposed policies of people who I don't know exactly what policies you want to do, but like the kind of policies that happen when anti-abortion people generally pass them. How do you deal
Yeah,
with it?
so
Yeah.
I think it's important to obviously consider individual policies on their own merit because I think we can absolutely agree that each policy, similar to policies put in that impact older people as well, each policy can be worded well or worded poorly to accomplish what we're trying to do, right? The other thing that I think is really important when we start to consider policy and kind of the political realm of this question is what is kind of the big picture approach we're taking? Because I think a lot of the problems that we run into come from a single avenue of addressing the issue. And what I mean by that is when I think about the pro-life movement or the response of pro-lifers to the abortion issue, there's actually three areas that come to mind as being really, really important parts of that response. The first would actually be crisis care and support. That if you have people, as we mentioned at the right off the top, right? If you have real people that are going through these real situations and need a lot of care and help, you need to make sure that there are avenues for them to get that, right? Alternatives to abortion that can address these very real difficulties they're facing. And that's where what we would call the crisis arm of the pro-life movement, which is organizations and individuals who are working to address those needs for people who are facing these crises, for people who have already chosen abortion and may need care and support and love to find healing afterwards. And so that's one piece that I think is really, really crucial. And we need to do more and more on. Actually, I'm going to keep referencing this pamphlet, but again, that's actually one of the resources we want to put in people's hands is how do you connect with that help and support if you're in that kind of a situation? The other is actually what we were doing out on the campus. That's an educational component of the pro-life movement to actually talk about this issue, to have the conversations like what we're having right here. And I love the fact that you said of like, hey, let's actually discuss the issue itself rather than, yeah, making stereotypes of either side and kind of attacking the person versus the argument that's being put forward. Let's get down in the trenches together. Let's talk through this and figure out what this issue actually is and whether or not it is a human rights violation. And that I think is crucial in addressing public opinion on the abortion issue, right? A lot of times, if we are solely taking a political approach, which is that third piece, what I mentioned, the three, then I think what we run into is people that feel like they have no alternative or don't see the need for an alternative, right? And so when I consider like policies in different places and how they affect people's lives, I want to actually break it down like that. I want to say, okay, is there appropriate support and care available that abortion is unnecessary? Is there appropriate education and conversation that's gone around this that abortion is unthinkable? And the last piece that was kind of brought up first is that piece of, is there protection in place that abortion is actually inaccessible that way? And I think if we get the order or we simply take one of those pieces out of context of the other, that's where we run into a lot of the problems that people are bringing up and are concerned about, is saying like there's not alternatives or there are people being left in bad positions, or I don't actually think this is a human rights violation at all, so why would I be against it? If abortion doesn't kill an innocent human being, then abortion isn't a human rights violation. But if it does kill an innocent human being, then should we kill humans to solve even the most difficult of problems? And that's where I'd actually come back to, I think, a really important point that you mentioned earlier in the question, which is we do limit certain rights based off of age and other things, but those aren't fundamental human rights, right? Like when I'm talking about all humans getting equal treatment, I'm literally just talking about like the basic right to life, the right to not be killed on purpose. And in the same way as like if someone wanted to drive a car, there's absolutely qualifications in place in order for them to do that. You can't just say like I have a right to do that. You would have to meet a certain minimum age requirement, like you mentioned. You would have to meet a certain requirement on training and prove that you have actually been qualified to exercise this. There's many civil rights that come at different ages or with different qualifications. And yet basic human rights around the world should be equivalent for all human beings. No one should be able to be killed on purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, because I think fundamentally the abortion problem does go down straight to whether or not it's like life worthy and needing of like protection of whatever rights we would like to give to humans, whether those fall under it. That's like the core and basically the only like at the end thing, because like even if it causes discomfort or suffering or things like that, it doesn't really matter if the core thing is uncomfortable. Like if there's two humans that are fully grown and adults and stuff, there might be someone that's pretty like terrible or whatever, but you can't kill them because the fundamental human rights. So I understand that. What I think I want to do now, I want to run by a couple, because I love like these little like hypothetical things. I want to run by a couple like theoretical scenario things, and I want to know like your opinions on them. So if you have a drug that can like make it so that, like, let's say sperm is one, it's incapable of like fully developing. Let's say like whatever, you have some drug that, and how it works is it makes sperm incapable of like developing into a full human, so that when it goes and fertilizes, it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't do whatever its part, doesn't pass on its genetic data, so the thing never actually develops and it dies and stuff. Do you consider that a problem? Because that intervention happens, well, it's still part of the guy. There's, and only to like the male like side of things. Is that then fine?
So that's where I look at this kind of takes us into a lot of questions that are asked around birth control, right? And in order to answer that, I would actually kind of zoom in on the function of if you're talking about preventing fertilization from occurring, that because this actually prevents the fertilization process from happening, then a new human individual has not come into existence. And there are definitely different moral questions that are asked around that, but that's not a right to life question, which is what we're focusing on if a life has not begun. On the other hand, if you're saying that like this would in some way like mutate the new human being, that their life would begin and then they would die prematurely as a result of what was done before their life began, then I would have a concern with that. And so even when I look, like taking it a little less hypothetical, when I look at actual birth control, there's certain functions that birth control has. So some for birth control, like spermicides, prevent fertilization from occurring. Others have three functions. They would prevent fertilization, be trying to prevent ovulation, and trying to prevent implantation. And the reason that they have all three is one, some the ways in which it changes the hormones and stuff often cause the three results at the same time, but also kind of as a backup function, that if one failed, then the other would still prevent it. And so if ovulation is prevented, then we know there's no egg to begin with. Fertilization is not going to occur. If fertilization is prevented because the sperm do not reach the egg, then obviously fertilization also isn't going to occur, and there is no life issue with either of those two functions. The concerning one is that in some cases, when the first two have failed, if implantation is prevented, you do already have a new human life that has begun, and that human life would be killed prematurely by that third function. And so to answer your question, I would have to ask of like, are we talking about preventing fertilization, preventing a new human life from coming into existence, which isn't a human rights violation because you're not violating that fundamental right we were talking about a minute ago of a new human being? Or are we talking about having a new human being's life begin and then killing them prematurely, which whether that happens through poisoning or dismemberment or something else, I think always is a human rights violation.
So you're generally against birth controls if they have the possibility of having the extra effect if something does happen to get whatever, like egg does happen to get fertilized, it still, let's say the body still like has a period and like flushes that out and would, in your view, end that life. You're not okay with that, even if that's like a very unlikely side product of something where it's like 99.99% of the time it prevents.
Gotcha. So first off, I would say, yeah, abortifacient birth control is usually how that would be referenced. So if it has the potential to end a human life, my understanding is that there hasn't been clear studies done on how frequently that would occur. We know that it doesn't happen all of the time, right? Because there's lots of times that all three functions work and therefore there's been no egg or there has been no fertilization and therefore is no human being. What we would often look at is the precautionary principle, right? If you know that there is a very definite likelihood of a human life being ended, then we need to use precaution around that, right? And say, if it is a violation of human rights, and we're saying that all humans should get human rights, then I think it's only consistent to apply that all the way through that human's life. If I was to say that, like, I think ending a human life at that point is okay, when ending a human life a week or 2 weeks or 2 months later is not, that would not be a very consistent position for me to hold. And my understanding is that anytime you have a human life and we end it on purpose, that would be a violation of that human's rights.
So I know another question, pretty different from that, but like that often comes up. What if both lives are in danger? Like, let's say we have the hypothetical scenario where you can only save like the mother or the child and stuff. Are we then? Is it then okay to make that decision? Or
So
like,
obviously, this is a very real situation people face and a very, very scary one, right? When you're told that your life is in danger because of a medical complication, that is an emergency which requires really good medical care, let alone when we're talking about now two human beings' lives being at risk in a complication that occurs during a pregnancy, right? Both the mother and the child inside of her. And so, with that, I want to just acknowledge for anyone who may be listening who's been through this, how much my heart goes out to people who are in this situation, and how truly I think we all believe there needs to be really good medical care available. Now, what I would look in this is actually just to clarify what we're talking about when we're talking about abortion. Because sometimes I think too much is getting lumped together. When I'm talking about abortion, I am not talking about any situation medically that we cannot save a preborn child and they die. I'm only talking about killing them on purpose. And so let me give you an example because I know oftentimes when I say that, it's like, okay, that's really hypothetical. So just a really simple example, a lot of life-threatening complications during the pregnancy occur towards the end of the pregnancy. And in that case, a physician might recommend delivering the baby early. Now, we all know that the survival rates of children who are born prematurely and put into the NICU is not anywhere near 100%, right? And so if that baby's delivered early and gets put into the NICU and still passes away because of the medical issue that came up and the medical intervention was not able to save both mother and child, that is still a very different thing than pulling that human's arms and legs off in an abortion to get to the same end, right? Of saving the mother, but now we have killed the child on purpose. And with that, I would actually look to medical professionals around the world. Here in Canada, the network that we generally look to is actually called Canadian Physicians for Life. It's a network of Canadian OBGYNs and midwives and nurses and similar groups around the world as well have shared that abortion is never your only medical option in life-threatening situations like that. So where we are currently at with medical technology, there's actually always an alternative way that they can save the mother's life without directly and intentionally targeting the body of the child. And so, in those kinds of scenarios, I think it takes a careful medical ethics analysis, right? That we absolutely have a mother whose life is valuable and who deserves excellent medical care. But if we actually have two patients, if we have mother and the human child inside of her, then we need to be careful to approach this in a way that treats both of them as patients. And to do that, I would actually look at the alternatives that are put forward by medical professionals who are working in the field of saving mothers' lives. as what would be the effective method to go if abortion is not an appropriate means of intervention.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand your position fairly well on that. Of if you have an intervention that's necessary to save the mother and it happens to like significantly increase the likelihood that the child dies, that's fine. It's the problem of like intentionally killing the child when there's not like a risk of life that's the issue. You know, I think the next point I will go to is one less about the ethics of stuff, because I think we've pretty clearly, like, we have your position, and I think we've covered a lot of the things people take up issue with. Now it's one of like convincing people, because I feel like I am not wholly convinced that the shocking imagery is the most convincing to people that like the protesting. I don't know how much more convincing you are holding up giant signs of like fetuses in comparison of how you might be if you didn't do that and try to just have a similar like whatever conversation about like ethics, why you think like a certain life is valuable and stuff. So I want to know your, I guess your, first of all, your just opinions on that. I don't, I'm not entirely convinced that it's the most effective strategy from your side.
I think that's a great question. So, the strategy of using abortion victim photography, showing the reality of what abortion does to a human being in the womb, is actually a strategy that we've adopted from social reform movements throughout history and actually even in current times. If you look at every single successful social reform movement, they have employed victim imagery to show people the reality of who is being affected by the injustice and the reality of the injustice that is taking place. So, thinking backwards a little bit here, everything from the abolition of the slave trade in England, which was run largely by William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson and some of those famous abolitionists. They used victim imagery to show the slaves who were being abused and killed on plantations in other parts of the world. The civil rights movement used victim imagery to show the injustice under the Jim Crow laws that was happening in the southern states. We saw the National Child Labor Committee in the US also use victim imagery to show the children who are working in mines and factories and being treated very unjustly. And also, currently, we see victim imagery being used in many social reforms, regardless of where you kind of fall in perspective to these more current reforms. We saw the Syrian refugee crisis use victim imagery to show what was happening across the world and woke up people in many countries. We saw the George Floyd video employed by the Black Lives Matter campaigns to show the injustice that they were fighting. And so victim imagery has actually been used by social reform movements throughout history and is used currently. And so employing that, what we actually see from polling that was done by a third party polling company using abortion victim photography as kind of their polling questioning, what we saw is that 67.4% of people were willing to acknowledge that they felt more negatively about abortion as a result of seeing these images. Now, this polling was taken 6 months after those people had seen an image of an aborted fetus, and they were still willing to say that their views on abortion had been changed, had become more negative because of meeting a victim, because of actually coming face to face with a human being who was killed by abortion. And in some ways, building a human connection. Because I think if victim imagery is only being used as like a scare tactic, that's how a lot of people think, right? That we're just showing the injustice, we're just showing what happened to that individual. But I actually think that's missing a huge component of it. Because there's also an aspect of when you come face to face with an individual that has been the victim of an injustice, you also kind of meet them, so to speak. You build that human connection, And that really touches on actually what was said by a pro-lifer named Greg Cunningham. He said that injustice that remains invisible will inevitably remain tolerable. But on the other hand, injustice that is made visible inevitably becomes intolerable, which is a fancy way of saying like out of sight, out of mind. People rarely care about those that they don't see. And so with that, I would actually look both to the historical effectiveness of using victim imagery, but also to the current day results that we are seeing in the campaigns we're running as well.
Yeah, no, yeah. If you have statistics to back it up, then it probably is a effective method. So yeah, and your ideal world would have abortion being banned. Um, yeah,
So
how do we? Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah,
if
you
I could
can.
jump in on that, because I actually think that's a really interesting point. I don't know if that would actually be the end goal that I'm working towards, or that we're working towards as an organization. That would be a political end goal. Whereas I would say the educational arm of the movement, our end goal is for abortion to be unthinkable. And in other words, like, would I like to see preborn children have the same protection under the law as older humans do? I would. But if we can effectively help people see that a preborn child is a valuable human being like you and I, and therefore they rejected abortion as a reasonable solution to even the most difficult situations they were facing, then even if abortion clinics were open and if not a single person walked through the doors, I would say that's a win, right? And so the end goal that we are working towards in the educational arm, the primary focus that we have is for abortion to be unthinkable, for to engage the people in our society one conversation, one interaction at a time to really help them understand why abortion should is a human rights violation and should therefore never be viewed as the solution to their problems. That would be the end goal that I'm working towards.
Is there anything you feel like I've missed here? I'm gonna actually open that to you. Is there any point, any things that commonly come up, or any things you want to say, um, on this
Yeah,
kind of?
a couple of things that come to mind. So one would actually be kind of jumping backwards to like the effectiveness conversation that we were having. The other thing I wanted to mention is that also in having these kinds of conversations, literally like what we're having on this podcast, but we actually see so many people who are eager to have conversation, or even if they're a little bit hesitant at first because they're like, oh, like I don't know where this is going to go. This feels like a controversial issue. Once they get into a conversation, they're so down for actually just like thinking about this and being able to share their perspective and hear a different perspective. And what we actually see is that for those who choose to engage in a conversation with a member of our team, 1 in 4 change their mind on the abortion issue. And another 1 in 4, so it's actually about 28%. So I'm underestimating by saying 1 in 4. And then an additional 20% who become more pro-life, which means that they didn't reach the point of saying, hey, I don't think abortion's ever okay, but they did shift in when they thought abortion was okay, maybe drawing the line earlier in the pregnancy or saying, I don't think it's okay in these circumstances. And so with that, we're also seeing a lot of really encouraging conversations happening and a lot of conversations that fit into that other half, that other category are still incredible conversations that I would absolutely invest time into. It just means that that person did not directly tell me or a member of our team that they had shifted in their position. And so with that, I am so encouraged by just what bringing this consideration to the public square, what talking with people about actually is bringing about. And I also am just find it so cool to meet people and hear their perspectives on this and actually get to think through abortion for what it is and for how we should respond to it with them. And I think the other thing that is so important on my heart to mention is just that many people have very personally been touched by abortion. There's about 300 abortions that happen every single day in Canada, according to the Canadian Health Institute statistics. You can also find that on the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada's website. So that would be a pro-abortion source giving those same statistics. And that means that every single day in Canada, 300 women have had a personal experience with abortion. Some women for the first time, others for the second or third time with abortion. And so when we're talking with people, we also know that there's reasons people support abortion that are not only academic, but also very personal as well. And so with that, we want to approach it in such a way as yeah, with compassion, with understanding, and knowing that this impacts real people's lives and trying to come alongside those individuals to help them think through abortion, also to make them know that they are cared about. And really, if abortion ends the life of one human being and leaves another human being with the result of that, right? Processing that in different ways. People who have had abortions, I've talked to people who really regret that. I've talked to people who don't regret that decision at all and think that was a good and right decision for them. But each of those people are also impacted by abortion. And I think that is a huge reason why we want to approach this in a way that says, like, hey, if abortion is violating human rights, then we need to respond to it. But that doesn't mean that we don't or that we want to mistreat people who have had abortions, rather quite the opposite. We want to care enough about them to share truth in a loving way.
Yeah, that's interesting point that you made that a lot of people begin to change their minds after like having a conversation with someone on your team who's like probably pretty dedicated to like trying to change people's minds and stuff. I would be curious to see what it's like on the other side, if like you see similar numbers of like people kind of just going with like whoever talked to them last, how much of that would be neat to see. But yeah, no, that does make sense. People don't like it. There is one thing I will note was interesting that I did see because of your kind of the way you do it. Part of the reason why I like was curious if the signs actually work and stuff, because aside from the signs, a lot of your people present very like put together, very kind of outwardly reasonable and like trying to talk with people kind of view, and that interestingly did contrast notably with protesters on the other side who are a little bit more like likely to like scream at people and do stuff like that. And so that did work, I think, in your favor a little bit of just like the kind of, because you see the behavior of like two sides. And that's just a comment of something I kind of noticed while like going there, which then prompted the sign thing, because that in my mind was the one thing that was like stopping it from being a very big like difference. But like yeah, if those signs work, then it's like, yeah, I guess it's an effective strategy.
And that's where, like, we know that the abortion issue, as I mentioned a second ago, is a really personal and really can be a really contentious issue because of the interactions that people have had with it. And so we want to be really understanding of that. At the same time, we hold our team to a really high standard of conduct because we, like you said, we want to engage in effective conversations. We want to be kind and treat people with kindness. Using the images isn't actually the opposite approach to that, but rather just believing that people do need to see the reality of what it is in order to be effectively aware of it and educated on it, and that this is something that has been true not only in this scenario, but in many injustices. And so while the pictures can be really hard to see, if we can use them in a way that is coupled with kindness and understanding and conversation, which is the conduct that we always encourage our team to be doing and we hold them to, then the reality of abortion still is a very hard reality to grapple with. And that's where the images are really, really hard to see. I find them hard myself to look at, to be honest. And I think that is because they show a really difficult reality. But if we can still approach that in a way that has good conduct, I think that they're actually a crucial tool in the conversation because they really present the evidence rather than just presenting conclusions, right? For many years, pro-life and pro-choice individuals have kind of stated their conclusions on the issue of like abortion kills a human being. No, abortion does not kill a human being. And while I think those conversations are meaningful, I do think they need to be rooted in a visual evidence, in an understanding of what abortion actually does in order to be effective. If I'm going to tell someone that I think abortion kills a human, I think I should be able to back that up with science, with the human rights that we've been talking about, and with evidence of why I think that is the case. And that's what our team is endeavoring to do on the University of Manitoba and actually across Canada, as we're engaging on this issue, is to be able to actually give a compelling defense verbally, but to also present evidence in this case as well.
Getting away a little bit more from the explicitly abortion topic about like more of you just like as a human being of like what other like beliefs do you hold? What other yeah, does that give you enough to go on actually?
I think so. So, I'll yeah put in a caveat here of like talking as a person versus like on behalf of the organization because even within our organization, there's a lot of different viewpoints represented on different things. So I think generally on like social justice issues would be along very the same lines because we see value in every single human being and every life, and so that would direct viewpoints. I don't know if these would really be as controversial, but I care a lot about other issues like human trafficking, like unfair employment and things like that. I actually have a sister who just recently graduated from law school, and the issue of human trafficking and especially immigration law is just really on her heart. And that's something that her and I actually were able to volunteer for organizations together when we were teenagers and young adults that were working to prevent human trafficking. So there's a lot of different issues that are on my heart in, yeah, just to be honest, I would say the same theme of human beings who I believe have so much value and should get, at the very least, basic protection, not getting that value, not being treated as valuable individuals and cared for in that way. Other controversial beliefs, I mean, I am a Christian. I hold to kind of like Reformed Baptist denominational views, and I'm really thankful for that in my life and that community in my life as well. This is where it's kind of not all the way across the organization, and similarly, um, also I politically would I don't even know if it's fair to say I would just like fall solely into conservative because as much as that's how I often vote, I don't feel like that party represents all of my views. There are some things I agree more with the liberals on, and there's some things I
Mm-hmm.
agree more with different parties. And I know that's the case not only for myself, but for other members of our team as well. And so different viewpoints on a few different issues. I'm not sure if you have like certain issues in mind, but those are a few things that I care about and a few things that yeah, kind of affect how I see the world.
One thing, so I know I'm jumping all over the place, and maybe I might have to even like edit and put sections in different places to actually make it make a little bit more sense with how like chaotic I am. But what differentiates humans from animals in your mind? Like, is it a just like yeah, look what why don't animals get the same rights humans do?
Gotcha. So maybe I'll answer this in two ways. To begin with, I would say generally speaking, I think that there are a lot of ways that we should treat animals better as like a personal viewpoint. Actually, an organization that I've been following quite closely on social media does like horse rescue from slaughter horses going to slaughterhouses. And I've been like doing a lot of just like research into yeah, there's actually a lot of like inhumane ways that we treat animals. that I think we could do a lot better at. I'm not against, like I wouldn't say that I am against animals being used for meat. I'm not personally a vegetarian, that kind of thing, but I do think we could treat them a lot better. And so that's a personal viewpoint that is not speaking on behalf of the organization. That said, where I think we're coming with from as an organization in believing that human beings should be given specific rights is even a concept of consistency, right? Of like, if you were to look at a group of individuals and say, like, all of these individuals should get protection on the basis of being human, even though they're different races, they're different genders, then it seems to be consistent that at the very least you need to give all individual members of that species that basic protection. And so in talking about human rights, I feel like we're mostly talking about inclusion in those basic human rights, not necessarily advocating against animals being treated better than they are. If I was kind of zooming in personally, I strongly believe from my personal perspective that human beings are valuable because they have been created in the image of God. As I mentioned, I'm a Christian. And I think that every single one of us has infinite value, whether they are very young or very old, whether they live here in Canada or under a government who does not recognize that value and does not give them basic protection. And so if you ask me, like, okay, what's special about humans in my personal viewpoint, I believe that humans are created in the image of God and have God-given rights because of that, that I think are inalienable, that go across the board. But even if I'm looking at it with someone who doesn't hold that same perspective as me, who doesn't think that we have God-given value, I would ask that question of like, okay, how do we just even be equal in how we give rights? Because if we're saying that a whole bunch of different human beings are valuable and should be protected, how do we make that point without consistently saying that at least all human beings should be protected? And I think about like, for example, if we were protecting a different endangered species, right, of like something like sea turtles, would it make any sense to say like, okay, we need like sea turtles need to be protected, and given that protection, you can kill baby sea turtles on the beach as much as you want, as long as you don't like fish the adult out of the ocean. Like that doesn't make sense. You either are consistently saying this species has value and therefore should be protected, or you're saying they don't. And by nature of that, they don't have that protection. And so if I believe that any human beings are deserving of more rights than animals and of more protection in that way, then I think it's only consistent to say that every human being is deserving of those rights, and the right being primarily that basic protection of not being killed on purpose.
Oh yeah, yeah. And to your point, I do think that like in the future, eventually, when we get like whatever lab grown meat or whatever, and we can like get those like the actual nutrients without the need for like actually having a human like animal, or not a human, but like the living animal exist and stuff. I think we'll probably look back on that and view it maybe as like a necessary evil, but not like a good of like, yeah, you don't want to like, they're living things even though they're not like as intelligent as us or something, but we probably don't want to be like chopping them up and eating them or keeping them in cages in very confined things and stuff if we don't have to. So I think that will probably change with like once we have the ability to provide better whatever care for them or whatever.
And hot personal take, I am totally down for saying that we could do way better even now than we are currently doing. Like, yeah, totally down for that as an individual. I think that there's a lot of things that we do for mass production that isn't actually okay. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think that's a pretty good whole thing. I have a final question that I ask to everyone, which is if you could change one minor thing about how the world works, how something about you can change one knob, do one little switch or something to slightly shift the world or universe in some way, what way would it be? What tiny little thing are you pushing just a little bit more to one direction or doing something like that?
Yeah, and I think this is going to sound a little bit repetitive with what we've talked about, but honestly, it's one of the primary things on my heart is if I could help people to see the value in every single human being and treat them that way, I think this world would be a far better place.
So yeah, I think this has been very good. So thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion. It's not an easy thing to talk about a lot of the times.
Well, my pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. I've really appreciated talking with you and also really appreciate your heart in having the conversation of just wanting, yeah, to actually think through it and share that with others. So really appreciate your time as well.